Hey, you, do me a favor, subscribe to this channel. Hey guys, welcome to another episode of Midnight Madness Chat with Hardman. I've got a great guest on the air tonight. He is an exceptional writer for multiple magazines and platforms and a book about legendary rock icons. Please introduce yourself and tell us what you do.
Hey man, how is everybody? Hello, I'm Steve Rosen. I have been a music journalist literally for about 50 years. Began writing back in 1973 and have written for a ton of different music publications, Guitar Player and Guitar World, and Rolling Stone, Creem, Circus, Jeff Beck, Ozzy and Sabbath, Free, Red Rhodes, Prince, Bruce Springsteen, and recent book, which is why we're here today, on my friendship with Edward Van Halen. My book is called Tonechaser, and it's about sort of my relationship with Edward Van Halen, beginning in 1977 when I first met him, and going through 2003. So
Let's start off with Tonechaser. Tell me about the moment you realized, like, listen, I have to write this book about Eddie Van Halen.
Let me go back a little bit in order to answer that question. So it's 1986, and Sammy has joined the band. The 1984 record has come out, and Van Halen is arguably the biggest band in the world. Edward is maybe the most important guitar player in the world. I am thinking that writers are going to start coming to him and they want to write his life story. And I thought, well, I want to be the person to do that, you know? So I built up the courage to ask him that question. And honestly, that took weeks mentally preparing. How do I ask him this question? Edward, I want to write the book on your life, you know? Because I was afraid of two things. One, he would say no, which would be heartbreaking. And two, he would say yes, which would be terrifying. It's like, oh my God, now what do I do? So I finally mustered the courage, and he said yes. I can't think of anybody else to write this book but you, which was an extraordinary amount of respect that he showed me. So I began working on the book, sort of fast forward about 3 or 4 years, and that's how long I had been working on the book. I would approach him sort of once a week or more. Edward, listen, man, we need to sit down and I need to talk to you about the book. I had done a lot of interviews with him for guitar magazines, Guitar World, a bunch of European, actually Japanese magazines, about his guitar playing, the musical side. But I wanted to sit down and get that personal thing, you know, what it was like when he was a little Edward, man. Did you, you know, were you a good little boy? Did you read books? Did you have a little friends? How did you do in school? He would never sit down for those interviews. And his reasoning was, man, if I sit down now and we talk about the book, the next record that comes out won't be in the book. So what do we do? And of course, I had no answer for that. So that book never happened. Our relationship sort of ends in 2003. And if you want to find out what happens, you're going to need to go buy the book. It was sad, to say the least. So 2003, 17 years go by. And I thought about that book that didn't happen over the course of years. But as time went by, it became less and less of something that I thought about. And then for some reason in 2020, some friends said, hey, man, you need to write a book. You need to write a book. And I always put it off, really thinking about it seriously. In 2020, I sat down to write a book. I wasn't sure what the book was going to come out like. So I sit down and I wrote what would become the first paragraph in the book. And the next day I look back at it and I go, hey, you know what? This is bad. And that sort of, led me down this literary path. And 14 months later, Tonechaser was done. It was one of those things, as much as I wanted to write the book, for all the fans out there, because um, I I was lucky. I was there. I got to hang out with this guy and saw who he was, and saw this personal side of him. I write it for myself, and I wanted to say, hey, you know what? If nobody ever reads the book, I can at least say I wrote the book. So there were a lot of reasons. Maybe some of them self. I think some of them, um, I wanted to see if I could write the book. How do you sit down and write a book about the greatest guitar player who ever lived? In some people's minds. So, long answer to your question there, man. That was sort of what kind of prompted me to write the book in 2020. I finished the book in 2021, and then it took me a very long time to sort of get it printed. I had it printed myself, so I self-published, and the first edition came out in 2022. We're now in the third edition, and the response has really been overwhelming. People have really loved the book, and they've written some nice things about it and about me, and I couldn't be happier with the way it's gone.
That's totally insane, and especially you are a very well sought after author, and you've worked with some amazing bands. So tell me about your emotional attachment, because I mean you've worked with some great bands. You've worked with bands from the Rolling Stone magazine, and many bands. So tell me about your personal connection. Why specifically Eddie Van Halen
Mhm.
was, what drew you to him specifically?
I mean, that's a great question. I touched earlier that I had written some other books. The first book I ever wrote was actually on Jeff Beck. That was in '78. I was writing for a Japanese magazine. It was the Japanese version of Guitar Player, called Player. It was all for guitar nerds and gear and that kind of thing. And uh, they asked me, could you write a book on Jeff Beck? Jeff Beck was and still is my favorite guitar player of all time. And so I thought, yes, I'd love to write a book on Jeff Beck. So I wrote that book on Beck because there had never been another book about him at that point. Mine was sort of like the first biography, and it was good. The book came out really well. I had interviewed him a couple times, and the book came together really well. But I was approached to do that. And in fact, your question, thinking about it now, all the books I had written, publishers had approached me. I was approached to write a book on Black Sabbath. I was approached to write a book on Free and Bad Company. I was approached to write these books on Bruce Springsteen and Prince, on Randy Rhoads. And so thinking about it, maybe that was the main difference. The book on Edward, nobody approached me. It was a book that I thought had to be written. And again, I don't want to make it sound like there was some higher purpose or something that was saying you got to write the book, you got to write the book. He was arguably one of the most important guitar players ever. And I had this very unique relationship. I had a seat in the front row to his life for 26 years, off and on. Now, he would go off on the road for a year and I wouldn't see or talk to him. But when he was back in town, we spent a lot of time together. No other writer ever had that seat. And I thought, I need to write about that. I want to write about that. I think fans would love to, be like a fly on the wall and understand, appreciate, and experience what I did sitting with Edward Van Halen in my little Hollywood Hills guest house where he's, playing one of my guitars acoustically. And he's playing me riffs from what is going to be the second Van Halen record that no one's ever heard before. And me sitting there just absolutely in awe and enthralled because I recognized what I was seeing and hearing and experiencing that maybe no one else on the planet was ever going to have this moment with him, you know, and I knew how important it was. And I think it was just a combination of those things that I don't know, I felt compelled to write that book. Now, that being said, once I started writing the book, I was really, I've always been my own worst critic. So every word that went on the page, I thought, dude, is this going to be like the most amazing book that you could write? It has to be perfect. I wanted it to read like one long guitar solo, you know, one perfect 580-page guitar solo, man, that had ups and downs and valleys and drew you here and made you smile and made you cry. And that was a hard thing to do, especially because the book turned out to be so long. Typically, music biographies were like half the length of what Tonechaser was. And even when I thought about the length, I thought, my God, are people going to read? Do they still read books this long in 2022, you know? And so I thought about all those things. There was a lot of rewrites, you know. I'd go back the next day and read what I'd written. I go, you fucking moron. You wrote this? And you really thought it was good? Man, and I would delete and X out stuff and start over. Just getting the chronology correct was a chore. I had interviewed Edward probably, I don't know, man, 20, 30, 40 times. I'd interviewed him a lot. And everything was on cassette. This is back in the analog age. And they were all labeled Van Halen, but for some reason there were no dates on a lot of them. I thought I was a pretty accurate sort of documentarian archivist. I thought, yeah, you know, July 14th, 1984. I thought every interview was dated. They weren't. So I had to go back and sort of reverse engineer and listen to the cassette, and we're talking, and he would reference, I don't know, man, a track off a record. And he goes, yeah, man, when that track came off the last record. And I go, oh, so it's fair warning, and he's talking about last record, so let me fast forward a year. So this is from whatever it was, 1980 or 1981. So that in itself was difficult. And then I had to come to the realization that what kind of a book was I going to write? Because we had a lot of these very intimate conversations. I call them in the book, I call them Twilight Tapes, because they tended to happen late at night. He would call me at 3 a.m. and he wanted to talk. And sometimes it was about music, and most times it wasn't. And it was about life, and it was about family, and how he was feeling and how I was feeling. And I thought, how much of this do I include? I want the reader to understand and appreciate who he truly was. And can I do that without including these parts? And I didn't think I could. So basically, it was a pretty uncensored look at who he was. And there are moments that are truly personal and poignant on my side as well. I put myself out there, and hey, Steve Rosen was getting high with Edward Van Halen, and shit, man, it was fun. I gotta be truthful, man. It was fun. I'm not saying go out there and do drugs, man, but it was a fuck of a lot of fun, you know. So that was the attachment. There was just so much of me involved in it, you know, and it took course over such a long time that I thought, if I do not write this book, I am lying to myself. There's going to be a hole in my life that's not going to be able to be filled by anything else. And so I went ahead and wrote it. And it was hard. It was a hard thing to do. So
there was a few moments there where I had goosebumps. I mean, you know, just the idea of sitting with Eddie Van Halen and, you know, having this personal, intimate relationship with him and some of the big artists you named. And yeah, just you've definitely lived a full life, and I'm glad you were able to put everything on paper. Talking about the Twilight Tapes, is there any instances that happened during the Twilight Tapes that is not known to the public, like some things that you might, hold back from the public?
There was one tape in particular. It got so deep and so personal. On both sides. I mean, I was talking to myself. I thought, oh my God, can I put this out into the world? And that's really the only tape that I held back. I thought, you know what, this is mine, and this is Edward's, and this is going to sort of remain on the cutting room floor, as it were. But short of that, I would say that pretty much everything we ever talked about and everything I recorded is out there. So the book gets written in 2020. My last contact with him is 2003. So you're talking about 17 years just from the last point I hung out with him. If you go back to the first moments, you're talking 1977 to 2020. I can't do the math. It's like 50 years or close to 48 years or something. So what did get forgotten, and it makes me insane. I mean, there are so many moments that I just simply can't remember. I couldn't remember. I'm sure that there are countless times I was up at 5150 and amazing things happened. I just have no memories of them at all. I mean, that stuff is just lost. But I really, really tried to recount every moment and went through on every cassette. It would trigger, oh my God, that's right, man. I remember, so last week we talked about that and we did that. So I would say it's 80%. It's 80% of just about every moment I spent with him. And that being said, I tried to unravel those moments as best I could, hence a book that is 580 pages long. So, rather than just sitting there and say, yeah, and Edward came by the house, and he was playing guitar, and I heard tracks off an unreleased record. I mean, I tried to capture every moment of what he was like and what mood he was in, and, the cigarette smoke in my room and gagging me, and, what does it look like watching his hands on the guitar neck, and how was he holding the pick, and did I feed him some potato chips or, protein bars, which probably made him gag. So I tried to explode out every moment, and that is the beauty, if I may jump subjects just a little bit here, of the audiobook. So the first audiobook comes out, and that was also something that I thought long and hard about. Because now it's like, oh my God, I wrote all these words, and now I need to find somebody to narrate them, because I wasn't going to do the narration. I thought, I'm not a professional narrator. I can't do it. I can't do it justice. It's going to sound forced or artificial. But at a point in time, I realized I'm the only one who could do it. Because I honestly thought finding a narrator who knew who Edward Van Halen was, or could sort of appreciate the content, I thought that was going to be impossible. So I go ahead and decide that I'm going to do the narration. And I'm going to narrate the entire book, which includes all those interviews that you've read in the hardback. And then I thought, you know what? That's not going to do them justice at all. That's not going to provide any insights. I go, what if I embedded the audiobook with all of the original interviews I did back in the day? And now you're hearing Edward's voice, and all those pages it required for me to explain all that, you now hear in one paragraph. Oh my God, Edward's happy, Edward's sad, Edward's open, Edward's angry, And so that's what the audiobook became. And for those people who have the hardback and then obtain the audiobook, I think that's what they recognize, and it's an even deeper dive into Edward, and I think it's amazing. I've never heard of another audiobook that has done that, where the audiobook has been has utilized sort of the actual right voice of whoever the subject was, whether it was an actor or a musician or a sports figure. You know, it's always a narrator speaking those parts. So I think it's pretty unique, and I think it's pretty amazing. The audiobook, I think, is over 20 hours. So it's just this remarkable archival stuff with Edward, again, dating back to 78 when I did the first interview with him. Again, all these little bits where you can hear him noodling on tape, because a lot of times we do an interview and he'd be holding a guitar, you know, and you know, there's one section in there where I call the chapter how to play guitar like Eddie Van Halen in one not so easy lesson, where he's trying to show me how to do a hammer on, which I butcher over and over, you know. But those moments reveal how incredibly, how respectful he was of me. I mean, I had mad respect for him, of course, but how he really cared about me, just as a friend, and not as a music journalist or someone who was going to write a story about him, because he didn't need that, you know. But you know, I would say stupid things in front of him, and he never corrected me about them, you know, or I try to play guitar in front of him, and I mean, I was a mediocre guitar player at best, and you know, he could have said, "Hey, man, no, not too good," you know. He just did that, and I think those moments, you know, in a spoken fashion, reveal this other side of Edward, you know, and allow you to understand this Edward Van Halen. So I love those moments.
You mentioned in 2023 you had your last encounter with uh, Edward. Can you tell me about that moment? And tell me a little bit more in detail what happened and the last time you saw Eddie Van Halen.
It's not because I'm trying to sell books, really, but I think if you don't have the book, the ending is pretty enlightened. So let me go back a little bit. I noticed that Edward was changing. Just his whole demeanor was changing. And really, the entire book, or from that moment on, I'm trying to explain why, what happened, what had I done, what had happened to Edward, why was he changing? And I have never been able to find one definitive reason. I think that there was some management stuff going on. I think that there were situations with the label. I think there were situations internally with the band. He was changing. The Edward Van Halen I knew was disappearing. And again, I don't want to give it away, but by 95, we hadn't spoken for a while. Interviews were being set up by Warner Brothers, because that was that the Gary Sharon record in 95, right? The three record. So Warner Brothers was setting up interviews. Previously, whenever I needed to do an interview, Guitar World wanted an interview, or you know, an English magazine or European magazine wanted an interview, I would call Edward. Hey, Edward, you know, Guitar Magazine wants an interview, man. Can we get together? Yeah, call me next week. We'll set it up. You'll come by or something, you know. And that's how we always did it. And his standing joke was, whenever I would make the request, oh yeah, just call my manager. You know, that was the standing joke. So in 95, or actually it was probably before 95, I forget, some magazine wanted an interview, and again, I'm trying to get my timeline correct. And so I call him and I tell him a magazine wants an interview, and he says, call my manager. And I start laughing, you know, and usually he'll laugh along with me, and he's not laughing. I go, that's pretty funny. Seriously, man, when can we get together? He goes, no, man, you know, you need to call my manager, you know, to set this up. And out of the blue, it was today we're friends and tomorrow we're not. So it's 1995. Warner Brothers is setting up interviews up at 5150. I wasn't even going to go. I thought, but why am I going to go? But I thought, you know what? I haven't seen it for a while. I want to go. So I go up to 5150, as I'd done many times previously. And the whole, he has like an out, all the cars are parked. There's a, and I know there's a bunch of, it's for all the other riders that are there. It's going to be a day of just going in and out. And so, I finally am let in and I see him, and I come down and it's like, hi. And the thing was, it was as if not only did he didn't know who I was, he didn't recognize me. And it's not like he was trying to put that face on. I just don't think he knew who I was. And from that moment on, it sort of, it never got any better. And I never knew what happened. And again, my first response, because I'm this kind of person who is so self-aware and responsible for everything that I do. So, oh my God, there's a a blizzard in Norway. That's my fault. I mean, you know what I mean? It's like I take responsibility for everything, whether I have anything to do with it or not. I thought, what could I possibly have done for him to have treated me like this? I go, had I said something to him? Had I somehow back in the day insulted Valerie, his wife? Had I broken one of his guitars? I mean, what egregious thing could I have done for him to have treated me like this? And I came to the realization that I didn't do anything. And if it was something, it was something so trivial that I couldn't even figure it out. So I never knew what happened. The friendship ends in 2003. Oddly enough, it's literally, I think it's the last phone conversation we ever had. And I'm talking to him on the phone. And there's a semblance of the old Edward in the conversation. And I'm thinking, oh my God, maybe he's the old Edward again. But then there were other moments and I go, no, this is not the Edward I ever knew. But he's talking about himself, which is odd because he talks about himself in a way that he never did before. And somehow we're talking about guitars, of course. And he says, yeah, I'm a Tonechaser. I'm always going after that elusive sound. And I said, do you ever find it? He goes, no, I've never found it. What was so amazing about it was for him to describe himself as a Tonechaser. And of course, that's where I got the title of the book in verse of this last interview. But for him to use words, and I'm not saying he didn't have this vocabulary, but I rarely heard him use a word like elusive, or just a concept about him chasing after it and never finding it. He would always say, well, man, yeah, I'm putting in some new pickups, or I got some new pedals, or I got some new outboard gear. I'm trying to get this sound. It was always more sort of an organic thing, him speaking more specifically. So I thought that was pretty enlightened. But yeah, so at the very least, I did get the book's title out of that last conversation, though it was a very sad and heartbreaking conversation.
That is a very sad story. I think some people might change, and it might be the industry. I think the industry sometimes takes your soul from you, and it becomes such devouring work. You're always on the road, and you don't have a home really. You're just always in some place, and you're not with your family, and you're not with your friends. And I think sometimes it tears away at your soul, and then you become a different person than what you once were.
You can find the book at tonechaserbook.com. tonechaserbook.com. You can find the audiobook at mysoundwise.com. One word, mysoundwise.com. And the audiobook's fantastic.